The word 12 used to mean something completely different than it means now. Today, a 12-year-old is in middle school, arguing about screen time, legally and socially defined as a child in every sense. The idea of a 12-year-old becoming a parent is now treated, correctly, as one of the clearest markers of harm a child can experience. And yet across most of human history, in most human societies, the transition into parenthood happened at ages that would trigger intervention in any country today. Understanding why requires taking apart several assumptions modern people carry about puberty, adulthood, and what childhood is actually for. Start with the biology, because biology hasn't changed, and that matters enormously here. The human body doesn't know what year it is. It runs on a reproductive timeline calibrated by evolution, long before written history existed. In modern, well-nourished populations, female puberty typically begins between 8 and 13, with first menstruation around 12 to 13, male puberty between 9 and 14. Nutrition and physical stress shift that timeline somewhat, and pre-modern populations with lower caloric intake likely saw puberty arrive slightly later. But the difference was months, not years. The biological capacity for reproduction has been present in young teenagers throughout our species' history. That was never really the question. The real question is, what happens socially and culturally around that biological fact, and why the answer looked so different from today. Life expectancy is the piece most people misunderstand here. When a historical population is described as having a life expectancy of 35, most people assume adults typically died in their mid-30s. That's wrong. Ancient life expectancy at birth was dragged down almost entirely by extreme child mortality. 30 to 50% of children died before age 5, with more dying between 5 and 15. Average those early deaths in, and you get a low number even though most adults who survived childhood lived into their 50s or 60s. What actually mattered for reproductive decisions was life expectancy conditional on reaching reproductive age, not nearly as different from today as people assume. What was different was the certainty. Disease, famine, and violence continued killing people at high rates well into adulthood, so delaying reproduction by a decade was a real gamble against real odds, in a way that simply doesn't apply now. If the math already complicates the picture this much, subscribe. Because the actual cultural story underneath all of this is even less simple than it looks. What childhood was even for looked different too. The modern idea of childhood as a protected developmental period, separate from adult responsibility, running roughly age 6 to 18, is genuinely recent, a product of industrialization and compulsory schooling, no more than around 2 centuries old. In nearly all pre-industrial societies, children began contributing to survival by age 6 or 7, gathering food, carrying water, watching siblings, and were doing adult-level work by early adolescence. That meant the jump into adult roles, including parenthood, wasn't a leap across a gap. It was a gradual accumulation of responsibility already underway for years. A 13-year-old in an ancient farming community had been working alongside adults for most of a decade, with real practical competence in the skills their community needed. Marriage itself also meant something structurally different. In most traditional societies, marriage wasn't primarily two individuals building an independent household, it was an alliance between families, and the young couple was absorbed into a much larger kinship network. A young mother wasn't isolated with an infant. She was surrounded by mothers-in-law, grandmothers, and experienced women who provided both the knowledge and the physical assistance that made infant survival possible. This connects to what evolutionary anthropologists call the grandmother hypothesis. The idea that humans evolved an unusually long post-reproductive lifespan, specifically because grandmothers measurably improved grandchildren's survival odds. Extended family support wasn't a patch covering developmental gaps in young parents. It was the evolved infrastructure human reproduction was designed to run inside. But the picture is more varied than a single story of universal early marriage. Among the Hadza of Tanzania and the San of southern Africa, two of the most studied contemporary forager populations, whose lifestyles most closely resemble the ancestral human baseline, average age at first birth is around 19 to 20, considerably later than the extreme age the title of this video invokes. The populations where very young reproduction was most common were typically intensive agricultural societies, not foragers. And the reasons were often explicitly economic rather than purely biological. In agricultural societies, children were labor and, uncomfortably, daughters were often treated as economic assets, deployed through marriage alliances, bride price, dowry, and marriage terms negotiated between families as real economic transactions, with age as one of the negotiable variables. This framing is uncomfortable from a modern perspective, and it should be. Understanding the historical logic behind a practice is not the same as endorsing it. It's a necessary step toward understanding why it was so widespread, and why versions of it have been so difficult to fully eliminate even today. It's also worth noting that not every traditional society treated puberty itself as the automatic threshold for adult status. Many built in extended transitional periods, initiation processes lasting days, months, or years, that had to be completed before full adult and marriage status was granted, often teaching specific skills the community actually needed. Even without modern developmental psychology, there was widespread cross-cultural recognition that biological readiness for reproduction wasn't the same thing as social readiness for the responsibilities that came with it. There's also a population-level arithmetic underneath all of this. In an environment where 30 to 50% of children died before age 5, a family that delayed reproduction and had fewer children was, statistically, less likely to leave surviving descendants than one that began earlier. That's not a moral calculation. It's demographic math. And it's telling that the historical shift away from early marriage tracks almost precisely with declining child mortality through the 19th and 20th centuries. The biology never changed, the demographic environment did, and social norms followed it. None of this means early parenthood is somehow equally acceptable today. The opposite is true, and it's worth being direct about why. The conditions that made early reproduction functional in ancient contexts are simply gone. The extended, multi-generational support networks that once surrounded young parents are largely absent in modern nuclear family structures. Children were once economically productive. In modern economies, they're economically costly. Interrupted schooling now carries lifetime economic consequences with no ancient equivalent. And critically, the human brain's developmental timeline hasn't changed at all. The prefrontal cortex still matures into the mid-20s. Ancient societies compensated for that incompleteness with dense social scaffolding. Modern societies largely don't. What was once adaptive is, in today's context, genuinely harmful, not because the biology shifted, but because the entire surrounding environment did. The lived experience of it was also fundamentally social rather than isolated. Young mothers were embedded in networks of experienced women who transmitted the actual knowledge required to keep an infant alive, not left to instinct alone. Young fathers were apprenticed into provision and protection skills by older men. Becoming a parent was a publicly recognized transition, marked by ceremony and a genuine shift in community status, providing psychological support modern society doesn't systematically offer in the same way. So why did ancient humans become parents this young? Because biology made it possible early. Because mortality made delay a genuine gamble. Because pre-modern economic and social life integrated young people into adult roles gradually, starting in early childhood. Because extended family networks supplied exactly the support that developmental incompleteness required. And because the specific conditions that make early parenthood harmful today simply didn't exist yet. The biology hasn't changed in 300,000 years. The world that biology operates inside of has changed almost beyond recognition. And that gap is where this entire, uncomfortable, genuinely important piece of human history actually lives.